Hi, my name is Sammy, and today we're going to be doing a comparison review between the 28mm 2.8D and the also 28mm 2.8 manual focus Nikon AIS lens. So first I'm going to tell you how I wound up with these two lenses. So I've had the 2.8D for about a year now, and it's one of my favorite go-to lenses. The image quality isn't, completely mind-blowing outstanding, but it's very small, and the 28mm focal length is really good for kind of like travel and casual photography. So if I'm going out to dinner with the family and I want to take a family photo at dinner, this is like a great lens to bring with. This little lens is great, but I always felt like something was missing. I wanted the same lens in the same form factor, but something that packed a little bit more punch to it. So I searched around online, and everybody kind of said the same thing. Go for the AIS. This little AIS is super old, and it's so old in fact that it took me a really long time to even find a clean copy of this lens. It wasn't at B&H, and it wasn't at Adorama, and so I actually had to go search around on eBay and dig through a bunch of listings and look at the pictures to even find a good copy of this lens that I could use. The lens got here about a week ago, and I've been super happy with it. To my eyes, there's like no scratches whatsoever on either the front and back element. And I'm not a lens quality analysis expert, but at least to my eyes, the lens looks super clean. Alright, so onto the review. So first we're going to do a couple of tests for things like sharpness and chromatic aberration and kind of compare the two lenses. Then we're going to take a couple of real-world images and see get a feel for how each of the lens renders. And then last up, I'm going to give kind of my overall thoughts on using the two lenses and kind of which one makes the most sense or which one I kind of like. First, let's take a look at the sharpness of the 2.8D. These photos were all taken about a meter away on a tripod using a timed shutter release. This is the scene, and we're going to take a close look at the text on the book to understand the center sharpness of this image. Zooming in at f2.8, we see that the sharpness is good, but not absolutely perfect. It gets slightly better at f4, and by f8, I would consider it to be very good, with a very slight improvement at f11, although I would say that to my eyes at f8 it's almost perfect. Next, let's look at the AIS. On the AIS, I used the same setup, but used live view zoomed in at 100% to achieve focus. At 2.8, it looks fairly sharp, but again not perfect. There's a slight improvement at f4, and a much bigger improvement at f5.6. By f8 and f11, the image looks nearly perfect. In terms of center sharpness, it's very close, but I would actually give a slight edge to the 2.8D. I was actually a little bit surprised by this because I assumed that the AIS would be sharper. Next up, using roughly the same setup, we're going to look at corner sharpness, starting with the 2.8D. At 2.8, it's not perfect, but it's actually surprisingly good, much better than I would have expected. At f4, there's a noticeable improvement, and at f8 and f11, the sharpness is very good. Next up, let's take a look at the corners of the AIS. At 2.8, it actually looks a little bit fuzzy to me here. I'd give a slight edge to the 2.8D. And then at f4, it looks a little bit better, and at f8, it looks much better, with a similar performance at f11. So far, I'm surprised by how well the D lens is doing. Let's have a look at chromatic aberration. For this test, I photographed trees directly into the sun, one of the harshest tests I could think of. First, we're going to look at the 28mm 2.8D. Starting at 2.8, we see there's quite a lot of chromatic aberration on the branches. Keep in mind that this is an extremely harsh test, and most of your images will not look like this. We see a very substantial improvement at f4, but we still see a lot of purple fringing, especially around these smaller branches.
At f8, however, chromatic aberration is almost entirely gone. And we see the same thing at f11. Now let's have a look at the AIS. There's still quite a substantial amount of chromatic aberration, but the performance here at f2.8 is much better. You can still see a lot of the brown in some of the larger branches, which I could not see on the D version. At f4, we once again see a substantial jump in performance, and you'll notice that it still looks a little bit better to the D version, at least to my eyes. Lastly, at f8 and f11, chromatic aberration is virtually gone. With the basic tests out of the way, let's take a look at some real images and see how it renders. These aren't serious images, these are just some samples so you can get a sense of what the pictures might look like. We're going to start with some photos from the 2.8D. And now the AIS. Okay, so now we're going to wrap up. I'm going to talk about these lenses in general and give you my final thoughts.
Alright, so other kind of minor things. These are both very well built lenses, but I'd give a slight edge to the AIS between the two of them. The AIS also can focus a little bit closer and tends to have a little bit better image quality when you get super up close. Obviously also the AIS is a manual focus lens, which means that, it takes some getting used to, but isn't always too much of an issue at 28 millimeters. Something that you should keep in mind though, if you're using this for kind of like a fun travel lens, is if you want to be in any of the photos and you want to hand your camera off to someone else and have them take pictures of you, having autofocus on your lens is definitely a lifesaver. So looking at the results of these tests, I was actually really surprised that the 2.8D really performed so well. Even though it had slightly more chromatic aberration, it was way sharper and just had really good performance all around. I think this is something where you really can't go wrong with either lens, but it seems like the D lens is the one that I'm going to use most of the time. I had a lot of fun shooting with the AIS. It's a really cool lens, and shooting always in manual focus was definitely a really cool experience to do. But overall in these tests, the D lens won out. So thanks so much for watching this. As always, any comments and feedback are always super helpful.